Okay, Pasa Mufasa, what's up, everybody?
Oh, welcome, Dennis. Before I give the word to you, and I think you'll be I would say jumping in your seat to start talking. And again, I see this picture from you, your awesome background, but it keeps amazing me.
Thanks, bro.
Um,
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. You say jump, I say how high. I'm ready to rock whenever, but let's give the people a little break to stretch their legs.
uh-huh. Yeah, and whilst you're stretching the legs, maybe with the headphones on, let me just give a brief introduction to you, because you have an awesome resume too. Because we're now like in a resurgence of interest in psychedelics and the role of media in that, and that shaping public perception and understanding of these substances has become increasingly significant. So how can the media influence the conversation around psychedelics, and what responsibilities do media professionals have in ensuring accurate and balanced coverage? And why do we always have to be so serious? There's some critical questions that I hope Dennis will explore in the coming 45 minutes. And Dennis Walker is a distinguished satirist, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, and a multimedia producer with profound connection to psychedelics. He's the host of the Mycopreneur podcast, a platform dedicated to highlighting and supporting fungi entrepreneurs globally. And one of the things I've seen you done recently is to really host incubators with fungi or mushroom entrepreneurs, and it's really cool to see sort of how that's yeah, growing up from, I guess, a mycelial network, to stick with the analogy. You have over a decade of experience in multimedia, and Dennis, your work has been featured in renowned publications such as Rolling Stone, Forbes, and High Times. And your contributions to this field have been recognized, earning you several accolades, including the 2023 Psychedelics Media Company of the Year and the 2023 Psychedelic Industry Reporter of the Year and the Psychedelic Influence of the Year in 2022. Within psychedelics, you've been a journalist for Lucid News, because we're in a way colleagues. You've had bylines in numerous influential outlets, including Psychedelic Alpha and Psychedelics Today. And besides your journalistic efforts, you're an MC and public speaker, where you bring your unique perspectives to various forums and conferences. And I think you're the proud owner of the one and only Rick Dublin Talking Muppets, right?
Got him here, yes.
Um, so today you'll share insights on media's role in shifting the psychedelic narrative. With us, we'll be drawing on his extensive experience and expertise in the field. So we're so excited to learn from your vast knowledge and your keen observations. So Dennis, the floor is all yours.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much for that wonderful intro, Floris, and thanks for putting this together, Alexandra, and thanks to everyone for being here. So I'm gonna jump right into it, and I suppose, screen share. Gonna give that a shot here. Hopefully, everyone can see my screen. Is that correct? Great. Looks like it can, and I
Yeah, it's working.
slideshow. Okay, are you all able to see this slideshow? I hope
All
so.
working.
Fantastic. Well, I want to introduce the idea of how media shapes public perception of psychedelics with a single pithy phrase that I remember learning my first day of my media studies undergrad program at the University of San Francisco. And that's that storytellers control the culture. Whatever culture you're in, wherever you are in the world, there's usually some stories that help to guide social norms and help people in society think and feel about different subjects. And those can be for better or for worse, depending on where you are and how you're evaluating it. So that's something very important, I think, to understand is that storytellers control culture. So drawing on that, I want to walk through kind of how I got started in this particular field. And that goes back about 17 years now to that first day of my undergrad study course where I started learning about media production, media strategy, media narratives, how media is made. And over time, of course, learning about psychedelics and directly experiencing them in a number of different capacities, I decided that it was time for me to start a psychedelic media project. And that kicked off in late 2020. It was very much a pandemic project. A lot of us had a lot of extra time on our hands. There weren't a lot of activities happening. So I thought this is a great time for me to really fuse my passion about media production and the media with psychedelics and mushrooms in particular. And the first thing I did is Google mushroom podcasts. I decided I wanted to launch a mushroom podcast where I interviewed mushroom entrepreneurs. And I was shocked to find out that there were only a handful of mushroom podcasts at the time. There were maybe only three. So right away, I saw, wow, there's an opportunity here to produce a podcast focused on mushrooms, and more specifically, picking my niche or my lane, the people who work with mushrooms and who build companies and projects around mushrooms. That has exponentially multiplied over the last few years. If you Google mushroom podcasts now, there's probably 100 of them, and there's more every day. So just to show about how important it is to keep working and being involved in whatever space you're in, I just published a new episode today about an hour ago with a mushroom entrepreneur named Jason Quinn, who runs Feng Straight. So I see this Mycopreneur project as my opportunity to help shape the narrative around psychedelics. It started out talking about mushrooms and mushroom entrepreneurs, but I'm at 175 episodes now, and it's given rise to a lot of other projects with a lot of other overlapping interests, such as psychedelics, people wanting to talk about their iboga projects, people wanting to talk about their LSD microdosing clinical trials, ketamine labs, MDMA. I've been able to interview Rick Doblin and other stakeholders in the MDMA process and mainstreaming of MDMA. So that's just a little bit about who I am. More than happy to welcome you to listen to Mycopreneur if you ever feel so called or you want to connect. I'm super easy to find. Anything related to Mycopreneur is done by me. All right. So how did I get involved in shaping this media narrative, and how does it extend to other projects and other people involved in how the media impacts public perception? So I started doing the podcast, started interviewing more people. Eventually, I started getting invited to speak at conferences about media, storytelling, and psychedelics. And at a certain point, that led to me getting interviewed by mainstream publications from my perspective. So I'll just quickly run through these. It's not the focus of the talk, but I want to kind of show some of the qualifications and some of the ways that I've been able to participate in the media landscape, shaping public perception of psychedelics. So this was after DiscoveryCon in San Francisco, which is a really wonderful 2-day conference that happens annually. And I got to give my speech as part of a panel, very much like I'm doing now. And then I was approached after the panel by a reporter for The Independent, which is a global mainstream publication. It's independent, but it is quite influential, based in the United Kingdom. And next thing you know, I got slotted under Sergey Brin, and they're calling me a microdose bro, which is kind of funny. I also got to see firsthand how the media actually selects certain narratives. And I have a few examples of this, because this was an hour-long phone call interview that I had. The whole thing was on the record. And I was very surprised at which quotes were selected, right? So mind you, when you read something, you read from a quote expert, you read a story, usually there's a much broader conversation that's happening. And then the journalist or the platform or the media, whatever their agenda is, whatever their prerogative is, they're going to finesse one or two quotes out of 10,000 words. And this happens very often. So it's just a simple fact of how media works. So this was cool. I really like this article. I think it's wonderful. And it's just cool to see how it works. This was another example from earlier this year at South by Southwest, which is a wonderful international tech and culture conference that also has a psychedelics track on it. And the same thing, I was approached maybe a month before by a journalist for the Austin Chronicle doing a feature on South by Southwest. They send me a bunch of questions, and I answer to the best of my ability, usually from a phone. At this point, I'm usually I remember actually being at a mushroom event in San Diego this day with 1,000 people and, all these different wonderful mycopreneurs and mushroom entrepreneurs. And then I'm next thing you know, I'm answering questions on a phone. And then a month later, you forget about it and it pops up on the day of the panel in Austin's biggest newspaper. So this is, again, just an example of how the media works. Briefly, I've been fortunate to be interviewed by Forbes and Rolling Stone a number of times. And this one I think is very interesting because High Times is a very reputable international global publication with over 50 years, I believe, in the business. And they're kind of the thought leaders of cannabis and of alternative culture and also psychedelics they've always published about. And I was looking for the High Times article. I've written two and been interviewed or featured as well in High Times, and I couldn't find it. It's like it'd been scrubbed from the internet. And I think, this recently happened with MTV. Their whole cultural archives from the 80s and 90s of journalism was just wiped out because of corporate decisions at a certain level that get made, that trickle down, and then it impacts the publication. So I'm going to look after it because I thought it was interesting. I couldn't find a single link other than them tweeting about it to two different articles that I wrote for High Times. So we are living in interesting times where there's a lot of media decisions that get made for the business of media that ends up impacting the actual journalism that comes out. Okay, cool. Hopefully that's not too self-indulgent. Now I want to talk about the actual way that media frames and influences different subjects so that people think about them in a certain way. And this is a very famous, influential early piece of propaganda that was made. And the difference between journalism, media, and propaganda is pretty thin lines depending on who you ask, what country you're in, what you're talking about. And I think it's good to have an overall comprehensive understanding sort of the way that media is produced in order to understand what you're reading and how it's being framed. Another thing I learned in my undergrad program is that media production and creating a product, it's a product. It's not that different from creating Coca-Cola or creating any other product like this mushroom coffee. Like media very much is a product. It's not always exactly what happened. It's oftentimes finessed into an agenda to meet a specific end goal. And in the case of Reefer Madness, which was produced in the 1930s, I believe that end goal was to instill fear in the population about cannabis. Now, this goes down even to the word marijuana. Most people are familiar with the term marijuana. Does anybody actually know where that term came from? Well, it was part of a coordinated PR campaign by Harry Anslinger, who's referenced here, who was the nation's first drug czar in the United States in the 1930s. And part of their prerogative was to criminalize and sow the seeds of doubt in the population about cannabis's properties, cartoonishly so, if you ask. Now, like a lot of people look at Reefer Madness and it's actually shown in cinemas while people get stoned. Like if you go to the Alamo Draft House or the Red Vic Theater that used to exist in San Francisco, it's kind of become this piece of kitsch, of novelty culture. Whereas at the time it was released, it was a very serious piece of propaganda and media. And interestingly enough, Harry Anslinger and the coordinated campaign that were a part of this, so they came up with the word marijuana to associate cannabis with Mexican immigrants and to instill fear in the population that if people were using cannabis or reefer or marijuana, that it somehow was associating them and inculcating them with these migrant populations that a lot of the nation was fearful at the time. If you looked at, quote, polite society, and in some ways, we're seeing the same narratives now, which I'll get into, about the open border and the migrants. And this isn't supposed to be too like politically pointed. It's more a sense of what happened with Reefer Madness is not exactly accurate reporting. It's not scientifically valid. It's very much what you could call a hit piece that was very effective at the time because there wasn't a lot of counter campaigns. There wasn't a High Times. There weren't, social media influencers to share their story. So yeah, Reefer Madness was a huge example of early propaganda, which extends to some of what I believe we're seeing happen with psychedelics right now. Another interesting point, say, well, what's so bad about cannabis or marijuana? Well, the media mogul, William Randolph Hearst, who owns Hearst Publications, it's a whole suite of media properties. And at the time, it was a very influential newspaper. I believe he owned the San Francisco Chronicle or a number of different influential publications. Well, hemp was actually being rotated into the paper supply, and it was replacing a lot of the paper mills that William Randolph Hearst had a monopoly over and his associates, essentially kind of targeting the tools of how media is even made. Of course, this was prior to most people having a television or a home theater, much less a device in your pocket like we have now. So people got their information largely and their education from these influential newspapers. So when a threat to the business model came up of hemp paper, it coincided with the threat of, you could say, independent thinking, or what cannabis is known for a lot of reasons, which is to unify people and have people kind of be questioning other narratives. Well, it made a lot of sense to want to demonize and criminalize this. And all this is happening in tandem with the early 1930s drug laws, which actually, I believe the first drug laws in the United States were enacted between the 1920s and 1930s, which is when Harry Anslinger was instituted as a drug czar. So that's coinciding with prohibition, with alcohol prohibition. I believe cannabis first became criminalized in the mid 1920s and certainly became overtly criminalized with publicity campaigns behind it in the 1930s. Okay, let's move on. So a number of things happened between the 1930s and the 1960s. One of them is sort of the beatnik generation and all of these different free thinkers that arrived when LSD, psychedelics, mescaline and LSD primarily, cannabis for sure, and other substances kind of escaped out of the lab and out of their context of medicalization, which they were initially intended for, into pop culture, which at the time was counterculture, right? So you had all of these different influential figureheads like the Beatles admitting that they smoked cannabis. Bob Dylan actually introduced the Beatles to cannabis. I don't know how many people have heard that story, but it's a incredible story. And you can kind of see how the 1960s took shape on a peer-to-peer sort of cultural influencer scale, where you have, I think it was either Lennon or McCartney telling the story about how they were at a hotel in New York City with Bob Dylan and they went up to his room. He introduces them to cannabis or marijuana or reefer, and that was a turning point in the career of the Beatles. They went from being the 1964 pop sensation of, these clean haircuts and suits and being on the Ed Sullivan show and having huge cultural influence sweeping America by storm, to, after these experiences with cannabis and then shortly after LSD, becoming these poster children for the summer of love and for the hippie movement. And so that ended up landing them on the cover of Time magazine. There's a whole bunch of interesting documentaries about different Beatles discussing their relationships to psychedelics. But the point is, all of this really came to a head and started cresting as this high and mighty wave that was rising and bringing a lot of people into the fold of this 1960s psychedelic counterculture era. Turn on, tune in, drop out, which is the famous Timothy Leary phrase, right? Okay, so all of a sudden there's Woodstock, there's the Human Being in San Francisco, there's an anti-war movement that's happening, right? The Vietnam War kicked off in the 1960s, I believe 1967 or maybe 1969. A lot of things are happening right then. And then you have psychedelics bringing people together, having, peaceful subculture. Not to say that's the full story, but that was very much public perception for a period of time. So what does that lead to? Well, that leads to the Nixon era. And again, in the 1970s, you've got the Nixon administration comes in and they declare war on drugs, the 1971 war on drugs, which criminalizes psychedelics. LSD, various other substances, but we'll say LSD as the primary, most influential substance, was being widely used or fairly widely used in clinical practice in the late 40s, in the 50s, and certainly in the 60s. Then it starts to become popular recreationally, or you could say spiritually, outside of the clinic, beyond bureaucratic and clinical oversight, where you have Woodstock happening and 100,000 people or more at a time gathering, taking LSD and questioning the establishment, and probably more so questioning the Vietnam War, rightfully so. And okay, so what does that lead us to? That leads us to later on, Nixon declares the war on drugs. The Controlled Substances Act is established, I believe, in the early 1970s, also in tandem with the Convention on Narcotic Substances by the United Nations, which was, I believe, 1971. It was all right around that period, coinciding with Nixon, with the war on drugs. All of a sudden saying LSD, cannabis, whatever else you're taking, these are actually extremely dangerous. We need to criminalize them. We need to criminalize possession of them. Okay, well, that happened. That's still going on today. The drug war is still very much full-fledged happening right now. Well, then you have years later a confession from one of the strategizers in the Nixon campaign, and that is Ehrlichman, this individual right here, who word for word comes out at some point in the 90s or early 2000s and says on record, you understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, which was another, you have the Black Panther movement happening. You have a lot of things happening at the time. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. So you see that there's actually largely and very arguably an ulterior motive to the way that psychedelics, cannabis, etc., are suddenly portrayed in the media. And you're getting New York Times headlines, you're getting late night television show, all of the who's influential leaders up to the president of the United States portraying psychedelics, portraying other substances as extremely dangerous, and even calling Timothy Leary public enemy number one. He was like the Osama bin Laden of the 1960s or early 70s, where you have the president of the United States saying, this individual who's pushing and influencing the idea that psychedelics and that LSD and cannabis are actually useful tools for human beings, he's actually an extremely dangerous public enemy number one. So all of this kind of shapes the way that we've seen psychedelics in the media over the last century or so. All right, I'm going to keep this rolling. Great. Yeah, there it is. So over time, we have this dark era, which I'm sure others will talk about today, between the 70s and I think 2006 or so, where very, very few clinical trials, very little research, very little funding, very little popular public perception was afforded to psychedelics. Like, you definitely had a handful of people. MAPS started in 1986, I believe. They're quite an influential organization. You had Rick Strassman doing DMT trials, I believe, in the early 90s with University of New Mexico. And so there was a few things happening, but certainly not like today. It was this kind of dark era of research, of very few people outside of these very small subcultures like Terence McKenna who are writing actively and discussing psychedelics. Well, that all changed really quickly, largely because of media influence and a re-strategizing or reframing of the narrative around psychedelics in the media. And that really kicked off, I think, in around 2006 with Roland Griffiths, with the psilocybin and mystical experiences research that was kicked off and pioneered by Dr. Griffiths at Johns Hopkins University. That inevitably made it into the New York Times, made it into a number of other influential publications, but it was still very slow to catch on. Well, fast forward to 2017 or 18, How to Change Your Mind comes out. This is a very influential turning point. You could call it a sea change in public perception of psychedelics, because you have an influential New York Times bestseller who's of a particular age that a lot of people will listen to this writer, this journalist, this author, this public speaker. They've built up a lot of mainstream recognition and respect and goodwill. And then they come out with a personal account, largely, of how psychedelics impacted them personally and helped them, dare I say. And it was overwhelmingly portrayed as a positive experience in Michael Pollan's life. Around the same time, you have a very influential film called Fantastic Fungi that came out. And I've been fortunate to have the director, Louis Schwartzberg of Fantastic Fungi, on the Mycopreneur podcast and interview him. And he'll tell you that he's been thinking about a lot of these ideas since the 70s, but it only became feasible to make this movie in 2018 or 17, whenever it came out. Fantastic Fungi at one point was trending #1 on Netflix worldwide, I believe. It had a huge impact. And some of these tropes from both How to Change Your Mind and Fantastic Fungi are still regularly repeated today. Like, two of the things that come to mind that I've heard, these tropes that are discussed either in the book or in the film, and then they kind of catch on and become a speaking point for other speakers and other advocates of psychedelics. One of them is this analogy of the brain on psychedelics, where your brain has a lot of deeply ingrained patterns, and it's like a ski slope, right? A lot of people have probably heard somebody say this. And the more you think about these patterns, they become rigid, and it becomes like these deeply entrenched ski slopes. Now, I'm not saying this is scientifically accurate. I'm reporting on a trope that's coming from How to Change Your Mind, or that's credited and associated with it. Well, with psychedelics, after you take those, it's like you can reset the ski slopes and you can change the way that your brain is wired, for better or for worse. In this case, mostly for better. So if you have an addiction, you have PTSD, et cetera, you can potentially rewire your brain. I'm going to get into it a little bit about how I've heard 19-year-old TikTokers selling courses and psychedelic retreats repeat these tropes. So is there scientific accuracy to them? Perhaps, likely, but Should we be having 19-year-olds sell courses online and invite people to do psychedelics with them because they're basing their advertising pitch on a trope or a quote from a book? I don't necessarily think so. So that's one. Another one with fantastic fungi is there's this idea, and it's shown in the movie, about the Woods Wide Web. And some of you may have heard of Woods Wide Web, of like mushrooms have subterranean mycelial networks, which is all accurate and very interesting, and that these actually function as the internet of the forest, and they share information, they share signals, etc. Well, just recently, and I didn't have time to include this in the slide because I saw it like yesterday. That's how quickly these things and the media narratives are evolving. Someone published in The Guardian, or a very high profile mainstream publication, refuting this theory and questioning it. And we're kind of seeing this happen now again with psychedelics. So the way the media has framed them historically, it's sort of gone from criminalizing, fear-mongering, dangerous, avoid, to, hey, these are great. Look at, don't you want to be part of the hippie movement, the free love, John Lennon, the Beatles? To actually, these are extremely dangerous again in the 1970s, and it's a Schedule 1 substance, and you should absolutely not touch this. It'll scramble your brain. Ping-ponging back to, oh, well, maybe these are really great substances, and everybody should look into them, and these are the future of mental health. And now we're kind of swinging the other way on the spectrum again, which I'll get into. So I just want to kind of paint a comprehensive overview of how media throughout the last 100 years or so, and definitely historically, but a lot less murky over the history that we can't really document as well, going back millennia, but all of a sudden to like hot, cold, hot, cold. Psychedelics are terrible. Psychedelics are great. Psychedelics are terrible. Psychedelics are great. We've never really had a balanced media portrayal of psychedelics. We have not had a lot of nuance. And you could argue that's true with a lot of things. It just seems to bounce back and forth between what is in demand right now and how we want to frame these things collectively. Okay, so now we get to today. This is a huge story that's sweeping the country right now. It's also hit Australia, and there's been a different brand with a very similar headline right around the same time. Now, I find this interesting. This is something we talk about in our incubators that I do, the Mushroom Entrepreneur Incubators I host weekly, that has really high-profile journalists and different professionals with backgrounds in media and many other lab sciences, et cetera. We've been discussing this, how there's been so many positive stories about psychedelics and mushrooms, microdosing, et cetera, positively impacting people's lives. And for a while, you had some really good publicity about clinical research, which is fair. There's not a lot of publicity necessarily about all of these life-changing stories outside of Michael Pollan writing his own book about them and, these fantastic fungi, et cetera. But this is a very serious case that happened, and it's something that needs to be publicized. It needs to be documented and discussed. But this brand called Diamond Shrooms is one of a number of emerging brands who are taking advantage of this kind of lax regulatory landscape and also the public demand for psychedelics that has come on the heels of what people could call the psychedelic renaissance. Like in the 2017, 2018, certainly in 2020, it really spiked. And you had all these companies IPOing, going public. You had all of these people buying press, which is certainly a thing you could do. You can hire PR agents, you can hire different councils and whatnot to get your narrative or your event or your clinical trial preferred coverage in the press. That is a fact. So again, it's like, who are we beholden to when something actually gets published? Well, who's behind that? Because the New York Times isn't really out there publishing too many stories about someone in Denver or in, New York City who started microdosing and turned their life around. There might be a few of them for sure, but when this Diamond Shrooms case is hit, which is not even mushrooms, that's what I want to get to the bottom of, and that's why I chose this one. There's a lot of these gray market purveyors who are unscrupulous. When I say gray market, I mean people selling psychedelics who are not legally doing it. It's certainly not legal, strictly speaking, but there's generally no enforcement around it. Like if you go into almost any dispensary or smoke shop in New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco, you're going to find one of these brands. Maybe not Diamond Shrooms anymore, but there's polka dot bars. I could go on and on with the list of them. There's dozens of these brands. People are buying them, and they don't actually necessarily have mushrooms in them. They have research chemicals in them. Now, when someone gets sick off of these, like is what's happening currently with diamond shrooms, it made every single newspaper, it made every single late night or television media program. So you have the New York Times running a headline on, I don't think the date is here, but this was very recent. Like this could have been this week. I don't see the date, but this was definitely in July or late June because this just kicked off. And the headline says, mushroom edibles recalled after spate of serious illnesses. Full stop. There were no mushrooms in those bars. They've been analytically tested by a number of labs. This is something else that somebody, who knows who, it could be these companies. There also could be any number of different actors involved in these kinds of events. And I don't want to speculate too much, but I will say factually, there are no mushrooms in these bars, diamond shrooms. Yet that's not what the public reads. The New York Times is one of the most influential publications on the planet. And for them to run a headline that, it's not mushrooms. I just want to make that clear. And this has been documented. This has been scientifically analyzed by multiple labs that this contains 4-ACO DMT or 4-HO-MET or one of these other chemicals that is a tryptamine that mimics mushrooms. So that's not what the end consumer reads. Like if you just blindly pick up the New York Times and see a headline saying mushroom edibles recalled, well, that's actually unfairly maligning mushrooms. They had nothing to do with this case other than the fact that this unscrupulous purveyor is advertising them as mushrooms. So I think it's very important that we look into this. Now, even knowing this, and this is a fact, there's very little of a retraction on this. The news is already out there. I should have put this other headline in. There was also a big headline, conveniently and interestingly, right around the time that a decriminalization bill for mushrooms predominantly and for other psychedelics was headed to Gavin Newsom in California. It had a tremendous amount of public support behind it. It made it all the way to the desk of the governor. And then what happened? Some of you might have seen this. There was an off-duty airline pilot who supposedly tried to take control of a plane and crash the plane. And he cited mushrooms he took 48 hours before as the reason. He cited derealization. He cited that he had an adverse incident. He thought he was in a dream. He tried to crash this airplane. That made every single headline news. It's so interesting that was right exactly at the time when this bill had garnered popular support. Again, it's not my prerogative to try to read too deeply into these situations about who's doing it and who's responsible. And it could have been entirely accurate. But one has to look at the timing and say, that's very peculiar and very interesting. And more so, that provoked widespread panic, a lot of questions, for people who are on the fence about, well, I don't want my kid doing this, or, well, I don't want to touch those things. So unfortunately, with media, there is a old adage that says, if it bleeds, it leads. That's never been more true than today. You can get 9 really positive, transformational, life-changing stories, or even just flat out fun, like going back to cannabis. Like it's incredibly unfair in the 1930s for them to have demonized cannabis in such a way to the point where there were claims that people were going to get raped by people under the influence of cannabis. People were going to die. People were going to become addicted. These really over-the-top claims, and not really any way to push back against them because the gatekeepers or the narrative controllers, if you will, people who have a lot of prestige, influence, power, they're pushing certain headlines that are not necessarily true. We're still seeing that today. This is an entirely untrue headline. It should read, research chemical edibles marketed as mushrooms cause spate of serious illnesses. But to the average reader, they're just going to have that headline stick in their mind or the pilot and say, wow, those things make you crazy. We should stay far away from those. So again, very interesting and slightly unfortunate that we have such an unbalanced media landscape that incentivizes salacious headlines and stories because those sell, because those get people to share, because those get people to engage, etc. All right. So let's talk about social media. This is a whole other kit and caboodle, let me tell you. So with the rise of social media, all of a sudden now we have billions of people. We have billions of people who have their own soapbox. And this, interestingly enough, has given rise to this new generation of psychedelic influencers. Ironically, I was awarded Psychedelic Influencer of the Year at a major 10,000 person conference event in Miami last year. And I thought it was kind of funny because I've never considered myself an influencer. I'll get into a little bit in the future, like how I sort of have this connotation applied to me and where it came from. But I thought it was very interesting that if you go on TikTok, if you go on Instagram, if you go on Facebook, there are so many different accounts who are legit psychedelic influencers. They're pushing products with promo codes. They're talking about their ayahuasca experiences. There's people who will live stream themselves under the influence of psychedelics. Do I think this is a good idea? Absolutely not. I would advocate for not having your phone on you at all. Personally. Now, that's a personal preference. I come from an era slightly before we all had phones and computers and timelines in our pocket where that wasn't even an option to take psychedelics and then shout out the whole world that you're doing it. I'm very grateful for that I got to form my basis of understanding of the media and psychedelics prior to even having a Facebook or even having an Instagram or whatever, and that I got to experience and learn about these things both independently, media and psychedelics, over a period of 15 years before I ever came out with this podcast and started discussing my perspectives. Now, what I see is somebody has a psychedelic experience. Maybe they're a little bit lost. They tend to be jarring if you take a big psychedelic dose. One could call it an ontological shock where your worldview gets called into question. Well, I've noticed this spate of people having these experiences and then wanting to jump into this emerging industry, which it very much is an emerging industry right now. And that has lent itself very well to satire, to people who take, ayahuasca, do a ceremony or do a retreat or take mushrooms. And then they launch a brand and a channel and they've got all kinds of stuff going on. TikTok is full of this. Like if you look at TikTok, people will tell you like, yeah, my life changed last year. I had a mushroom experience and now I have a website, I have a .com, I have a platform, I started a newsletter, I'm pushing these products. I'm a little bit concerned about that because I think that you need quite a bit of time to be able to understand how these substances, psychedelics, will actually impact you in your life. I don't think you can really speak from a place of knowledge and wisdom when you're in what I call the honeymoon phase of psychedelics. And I think the honeymoon phase is kind of ending for this era right now. Like we had a honeymoon phase where for a couple of years, it was unilaterally positive, like the clinical evidence coming out, all the work that MAPS has done, et cetera. These are, again, mind you, institutional narratives, not too many narratives coming out from just like average people having a great time and safely in community using these substances. But it was kind of like either end of the extremity spectrum, either super positive or super negative. And with social media, people tend to only want to share the super positive angles. I think all of us are guilty of this. I certainly do it. Like, how often do you want to share that you had a terrible day or that you had a terrible trip? Not necessarily. Like, you're going to go on there and share about the glow. You're going to share about how awesome your ayahuasca experience was and how it made you such a better person. Maybe this is true, but the idea of like getting up and evangelizing and sharing that with others, I wrestle with that personally. And in my own accounts, I largely try to present a nuanced narrative and a nuanced, pragmatic perspective. On the podcast that I do, I often talk about adverse experiences in my own life or in the lives of others, and also ways that you can mitigate against those and ways that you can be responsible. What I see happening right now with social media is you have these brands popping up. They incentivize people to promote them and they'll send you free product. They'll be like, here, we're going to send you a box of mushroom chocolate bars. And I see people popping up on my feed who say, I just got these sent to me by this person or whatever, and use my discount code and you get 15% off. I think that's a slippery slope. I think that, it's much better to do it one-on-one. Like if you know someone, if you have rapport with someone, if you have a friend in your community who's asking you, that's different than just blanket marketing psychedelics to anyone and everyone. Now, I do think that the psychedelic education is very important. We should push that. There should be open discourse, but people on social media presenting these very one-dimensional and oftentimes biased narratives and accounts of how psychedelics so positively impacted them, that could lead to false expectations. So I've written about this for Lucid News, which is a platform that had been very robust for a couple years and that has been a little bit quiet lately. But they do really quality independent journalism, and I've been fortunate to write for them. So I wrote about this performative drug content on social media, and it turns out there's actual peer-reviewed research going into this right now at Stanford, University of Southern California, with the participation of some friends who are researchers at Stanford, that said that 27 of 30 students that they had interviewed for this study had been exposed to peers using substances on social media through personal accounts and posts. Now, these are high schoolers that they're interviewing. These are like freshmen, 14, 15, 16, who are going online and sharing often positive, fun light, which directly contradicts the messaging of government-sponsored drug education initiatives. So this creates cognitive dissonance, is what I'm getting at. And I think that's what social media is largely doing right now around is there's a lot of cognitive dissonance that's being created because you have official government drug education programs like the DARE program advocating for abstinence, saying, just say no, don't do this, this is not worth it, these drugs are dangerous for X, Y, and Z. Yet then a kid gets on social media and 27 out of the 30 students that were interviewed for this are saying that they'd been exposed to positive, light, fun portrayals of drugs. Vaping, teens vaping, teens talking about microdosing or psychedelics or whatever. Well, this creates that cognitive dissonance because where is the harm reduction based, data driven, trauma informed pedagogy in the middle that says, okay, psychedelics, mushrooms could potentially be very safe, thousands of years of ancestral cultural use and documentation. However, if you have a family history of psychosis, maybe you're not in a good place mentally right now. I mean, the whole world seems to be suffering a severe mental health crisis right now. Maybe this isn't something that you should do without a professional your first time. Again, I feel very fortunate in that when I first became interested in mushrooms, I was in very sound mental health. I'd like to still think I am largely, but I was an athlete. I was going to college, getting ready to go off to college. I was very focused on my baseball and school life. I had a strong family background. I had a lot of things in my life that helped serve as an anchor so that when I did a low dose, and I had read about them for several years up to that point, I had been reading about mushrooms for over 2 years, like deep dive accounts on Arrowwood, reading Terrence McKenna, talking to different peers and friends. So it wasn't just like I blindly bought a random chocolate bar, which unfortunately seems to be how a number of people are going about it today. And also, I had people with me who told me, yo, we're going to take a small dose because we don't need to be tripping too hard. We need to start low and go slow. And I'm very fortuitous and fortunate in that regard. I try to pass that education along to people. Like, just because other people are jumping up online, and they are, and talking about taking 10 grams of mushrooms does not mean that you should take 10 grams of mushrooms, much less your first time in a public setting. Really, really good idea if you do feel called to do something like this, be it mushrooms, LSD, etc., that you do your homework, you do your research, you talk to different sources, you don't get all your information from one friend, right? You look online, etc., and then you do a small dose. You do a gram or so. You see how it impacts you. And just to round out this line of thinking, I was very much an evangelist for years. It had a very positive influence in my own life. I'm very grateful for my own psychedelic experiences. I had a good friend for a number of years that was a former colleague. And I asked him one day, hey, have you ever taken mushrooms? Point blank, he said, yeah. First time I took them, I got naked and punched a cop in the face. Okay, that is not what you want happening at all. And that's not what we want happening. So the idea that we can just like blanket promote psychedelics and everyone should take them is very questionable, because while that may be a very isolated incident, and there's probably a lot of extenuating circumstances, which I know that individual, what was happening in his life with a number of personal issues, we need to be able to have accurate education and have good peer networks that can empower people to say, hey, this person should have a trip sitter with them. Hey, this person probably shouldn't be taking 3.5 grams by themselves their first time. So again, social media has a lot of performative content. Unfortunately, that extends to psychedelics both ways. All right, back to this. I hope you all are enjoying this. I'm enjoying this. All right, cool. So yeah, it turns out there is an actual study that's ongoing, and I believe was published, yes, in the Neuropharmacology Journal about science being sabotaged by social media. So yes, there's a lot of challenges, a lot of pressures. Now, on the other end of that, there's also a lot of questioning going into the peer-reviewed resources and journals about who gets to publish what narrative, and who gets to sponsor a clinical trial and how that shows up in the media, et cetera. So that's probably a broader topic for another day. But in general, I think it's good to exercise cautious optimism and skepticism when you're presented with these various claims, because there are companies that have hundreds of millions of dollars invested in prioritizing a certain outcome. And there's been a number of different incidents involving pay to play, not just in public or popular media, but in scientific journalism as well. And even within the scientific community, there's a lot of ongoing debates as we're seeing play out in real time. I'm sure other people like the previous speaker have discussed this about how that's showing up in the psychedelic space right now. You have two factions or two different ideologies claiming that they're scientifically accurate, telling us to follow the science. Yet both of these factions or different ideological stakeholders are both claiming to be scientists and are directly going head to head saying, follow the science. So it's a very interesting time. This is going to lead me into satire. That's what I've landed on. I still do the Mycopreneur podcast. I published an episode today. I host the weekly incubators, but I found a really sweet spot in doing satire. And I find that the world really needs humor and satire, especially in the media landscape right now. And that it actually is a very effective way of communicating different interesting points or interesting observations. I happened upon this haphazardly. I was a year into the Mycopreneur podcast. I had already been to a few conferences where I got invited as press. And I got to, after those invitations, all of a sudden I got to start interviewing the CEOs of publicly traded companies and these C-level executives of very well-funded psychedelic research organizations, companies, et cetera. And I started making satire kind of as a knee-jerk reaction to how ridiculous a lot of these things were and what's going on. And it turned out that it was really popular, that almost immediately all the satire I was doing started getting shared widely. It started getting spread to the furthest corners of the earth and going viral. And I had people that I knew from college who I hadn't talked to in a decade contact me from Cairo and tell me, my friends in Cairo in a WhatsApp thread are sharing this post that you made, and I just noticed it was you, this video that you did. Mexico City, Peru, over in Bangkok and Bali. I realized at that point, like, people are hungry for this. There's a lot of people who think that the lifestyle, the media landscape, the political landscape, et cetera, has really reached a boiling point where everybody's upset, everybody's angry. Nobody really knows what to believe because you have scientists and thought leaders coming at us from both sides with differing perspectives. And all of a sudden, when you create a satire or this particular brand of satire, it landed and it was organic is the coolest thing. I didn't pay anyone. I didn't have any expectations. It simply landed with an audience who wanted to share it with their audience. And then, so this is one example of a reel I did, which is kind of satirizing these TikTok influencers. I got active on TikTok. I actually used to teach at a public high school. I taught multimedia production 2017 through 2019. And the students that I had were on TikTok. It was brand new at the time. They were actually trying to get me to join TikTok. And I was like, that's the last thing I want to do is be on a social platform with all of my students at that time. Students have a tendency to try to use things that they find about personal life on the teacher. And while it was all fun, I had other colleagues who had their students like find their Facebooks, go back to college photos, print out photos of them at a party and spread them around schools, things like that. So it's generally best practices not to have too much overlap. Anyways, I'm still friends with a number of the students and professionally connected to them, certainly not all of them. So I found once I did get onto TikTok in 2022 or so, something like that, I just decided, all right, I'm going to crack this platform, which I did, get tens of thousands of followers, which I did, and then ultimately get deplatformed, which I did. And we can talk about that briefly. It's very easy to arbitrarily and selectively be deplatformed for any reason these days, as a lot of you know, especially if you're talking about mushrooms or psychedelics. But lots of people are not, and they manage to do it. So rather than try to satirize a single TikTok influencer or like go after someone by name. That's never been my like motivation. It's always been to kind of create an archetype. So I try to like differentiate, not create any personal identification for most of the stuff, so that it's just this idea. It's an archetype rather than an individual. And I found quite a few of these TikTok influencers. Now, these are real text. This is real text that was taken off of their posts. I know other satirists or kind of like influencers and comedians who will use the actual posts from people. I don't like that because I don't want to send a rage mob or, people over to that profile. So I selected them, put them on a different image. But this is for a program that was being sold by a 19 or 20-year-old TikToker, a very young person by their admission, who talked about, they had just finished high school and then they discovered mushrooms and then they moved to another country where they could do mushroom ceremonies. And they are selling a program around mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms specifically, and ceremonies that is guaranteeing people that they will teach you how to authentically create and sell a program generating 5 to 20,000 per month. Also, how to create unstoppable confidence, how to coach with mushrooms, how microdosing and mindset. Now, mind you, again, this is very questionable when you have a lot of people going through mental health epidemics, through not knowing how to navigate. You see someone online, they're beautiful, it could be any gender of whatever. They have a popular following. They have 200,000 Instagram followers or TikTok followers. They're happy. They're at nice dinners and they're selling this program. Maybe I want to get involved with this program. To me, that's like a real slippery slope. If that's how we're representing psychedelics, where you have 19-year-olds selling programs, telling you you're going to make $5,000 to $20,000 a month after you do their mushroom ceremonies and their mushroom coaching programs. Now, mind you, this isn't just one person. There's a whole bunch of people. And it's not my job to rain on their parade. I don't go on there. Maybe someone else does that. But it does kind of lend itself nicely to satire, which obviously has landed with a global audience. So I'm going to keep doing it. All right, onward. Here's another example. And again, like, I'm not here to tell anybody what to consume or how to consume it, but this is an interesting product that I always was drawn to because of their bold marketing strategy. Psychedelic water. They went viral on TikTok. It very much was launched on TikTok. They gave psychedelic water to a lot of different influencers. It has 100% legal ingredients, which arguably has zero psychedelics whatsoever in them. It has, I can't remember if it's canna or, these other substances, Damiana or whatever, which it's 100% different. If you're going to take 2 grams of mushrooms or a gel tab of good LSD versus a psychedelic water, there is no comparison. Yet they were very much piggybacking off of the momentum and the clout and the public interest in psychedelics. They raised millions of dollars. I don't know what they're up to now, but they absolutely cashed out. They had tons of influencers. They were throwing parties. They got to the point where I think they were maybe doing over $10 million of revenue, and power to them. Like, they created a product. They didn't break any laws. So I'm not here to cast shade on them other than to say that this kind of is not that far off from some of the other things we're seeing about like these mushroom chocolates that have zero mushrooms in them. They're simply capitalizing upon public interest and a lack of education and understanding around psychedelics. And it worked out for them, I suppose. Cool. All right, I'll breeze through these so we can leave a few minutes for questions. But these are kind of some of the satirical reels that I do. Now, I turn these into posts, but typically I do videos, and I try to do a video every day. I discovered I have a penchant for making satirical short videos. I did it by accident when I mentioned I had one reel blow up, go super viral, and all of a sudden afford me all these opportunities and getting quoted and getting, to speak at conferences. So I discovered like, this is fun. It's a largely untapped niche. That's my niche in the media landscape. Like, and the more I do serious journalism, the more I hate it, because no matter how accurate and peer, if you're quoting sources and experts, it's just such a polarizing landscape that you inevitably run into friction with people. But it happens with satire too, but it's so much more fun. Like, it's just genuinely fun to create satire. So I've essentially started branding myself as the Onion of the psychedelic space. Yes, there still are incubators, mushroom entrepreneur podcasts. People who know me, they understand that. But the broader public probably sees me as the satirist, as someone who does satire. So these are four archetypes, like I mentioned, that I've seen with media. And I very much think social media is so influential, more so than legacy media. Legacy media being New York Times, The Guardian, et cetera, BBC, Fox News, social media, arguably having a lot more influence specifically with younger generations, to the point where over 50% of Gen Z, I don't think people have recognized that yet, like how influential. Also, another one, talk about how media frames societal issues and public perception of psychedelics. The whole congressional act to ban TikTok. Very interesting that the most influential platform, which is used more than Google, which is by far what Gen Z is on, is all of a sudden being moved to be outlawed by Congress, and for any number of reasons. Well, it has a lot of influence, and there's not necessarily a lot of regulatory oversight and control coming from certain entrenched interests because it is an overseas-based platform. So that's neither here nor there, but it's interesting to note. So yeah, one archetype is the 22-year-old TikTok shaman. I think we've met a lot of these as, younger people start. There's actually a double blind article, which is another really cool platform in psychedelics I got to write for and collaborate with a number of times. Double Blind Magazine. They just did an article on a 15-year-old from Russia. He's 15 years old. His parents took him to Peru or Ecuador or something, maybe Colombia, to an ayahuasca retreat, did ayahuasca. He now leads ayahuasca ceremonies in Bali, and he's 15 years old. And this obviously raises a number of questions, like somebody who just had an experience. Both of these countries have very lax bureaucratic regulatory oversight, especially if you can generate some capital. And I'm not going to say that there haven't been other 15-year-old spiritual elders or influencers before. Some cultures have them and they learn very early. It's questionable if that's what's happening in this case, but it seems to be inspiring a lot of copycats, like, wow, that person can do it. They're making money. There's no rules around this. Why don't I start my own ayahuasca ceremony or mushroom coaching program? All right, continue. Cool. Here's another one too, the microdosing coach. It's funny because I actually work with a number of microdosing programs and friends and whatnot, and I kind of still provide this skeptical, kind of satirical roasting of them. But I think all of us have probably seen microdosing coaches. There's probably some in the audience right now. I think that's totally fine. Like, do your thing. It's still a piece of satire to me when someone has a mushroom experience and then they turn around and start launching these programs overnight. And that's my take on it. But again, I'm pretty open-minded. It's not my job to tell people what to do. It's my job to create funny, original, satirical content and let people interpret it as they will. Cool. The carnival barker. This one extends to all the different corporadelic people we're seeing, which I've interviewed a number of them who, by their own admission, have sometimes never had a full psychedelic experience, or maybe they just had one. And now they're positioning themselves in the media, at conferences, et cetera, as essentially psychedelic thought leaders because they have capital, they have connections, et cetera. You can easily, this is something we saw actually, is mining companies in Canada were doing reverse takeovers. It's a sort of like a way of avoiding the fees and the time of listing on a public stock exchange, merging with psychedelic entrepreneurs and then rebranding as psychedelic companies. So some of those early publicly traded psychedelic companies, which I don't want to name names, they were actually mining companies, literally extracting precious metals from the earth in different regions like Canada. And then mining is binary. It's either boom or bust. Either you hit pay dirt or you find nothing and then you look to rebrand because you invested all this money and you take a psychedelic company public. And this is factual. This has been happening. Last one is the conspirituality cult leader. A lot of very colorful, charismatic people who you could say borderline on cult leaders. If you've been involved in psychedelics for a while, you've probably heard about or read about a few of them. And I just want to show real quick, this is me all the way back in 2010 at Hippie Hill in San Francisco. This was as a junior in college with my 16 millimeter Bolex camera. I made a class project film about 420 when everyone descends upon Hippie Hill and smokes cannabis together. I've been doing this a long time across mediums. I didn't just pop up as a social media influencer. There's many years and hard-earned knowledge and wisdom behind what I do. And I like to explain that to people because a lot of times I get like, Who is this guy? Where did he come from? Well, I've been studying this for a long time. All right, a few more things here. The role of the jester. We don't have much time. Just want to say that the role of the jester, which I've kind of stepped into, I suppose, according to other people, is historic. It's been across many different cultures. And talk about satire. Here's some of the other satire I do. And I want to get to the point. This is how you can contact me. Mycopreneur. Actually, it's a new Instagram because I got deplatformed at 25,000 followers, and then Rolling Stone wrote about it because it was just completely arbitrary platforming out of nowhere. But anyways, Mycopreneur podcast, Mycopreneur official on Instagram. I'm sure my links will be attached to all of this. And thank you all very much for joining me and for listening to me discuss the way that media frames public perception of psychedelics. I really appreciate all of you. Hopefully something was interesting about this, and I'm happy to answer questions and hang out for a while right now. And thank you again to Alex and to Flores for putting this on.